Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to be here this afternoon to address this extremely important Opposition Day motion put forward by the NDP. It's an important motion for three reasons. First of all, it calls for public consultations on a specific deal, this Nexen-CNOOC deal, which is under negotiation. It calls for public hearings into foreign ownership in the Canadian energy sector writ large. And thirdly, it calls on Canada and the government to clarify the net benefit test in the Investment Canada Act before a decision is made with respect to this specific transaction. For the record, the Liberal Party will be supporting this motion. But let's just step back for a few minutes and look at how we got just where we are today. This proposed acquisition has been in the works for a long, long time. It follows hard on the heels of the proposed potash deal, which raised so many similar concerns and issues. Both Nexen and CNOOC, as parties to this proposed deal, played by the existing rules, even though they knew that changes to the definition of net benefit under the Investment Canada Act were supposedly forthcoming. In fact, the Prime Minister stood in this place with a number of frontline cabinet ministers 2 years ago and promised that a major review of what constituted a net benefit to Canada would be undertaken. It was never done, even in the full knowledge that this and other deals were in full negotiation. My colleague, the member for Halifax West, our Liberal industry critic, brought a motion to the Industry Committee almost 9 months ago. And let me read it. It's simple and it's direct. He proposed that the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology undertake a study of the Investment Canada Act and present a report to the House. It turns out the committee rightly decided to pursue the study, although we don't really know what was said because, once again, the deliberations were held in camera, behind closed doors, a neat little trick pulled by the Conservatives across all committees to censor access to information on a very regular basis. Since then, Mr. Speaker, nothing. Did the government recall the committee over the summer months to take a crack at the study? No. Did it produce a comparative study of what other countries who have tackled these issues have done? No. Did it identify and make public the salient questions to be addressed beyond the 6 factors to be taken into account under Section 20 of the Investment Canada Act? Absolutely not. So here we are. Shareholders and the board of directors of both companies involved have approved the deal. They believe their interests are best served. Well, that's fine. That's as it should be in the free market. But what we're talking about are Canadian interests, not shareholder interests exclusively. So it is at once the irresponsibility and the incompetence of this Conservative regime which has led us to this point. Irresponsible and incompetent in the fact that the net benefit test has not been dealt with. Irresponsible and incompetent in the fact that they have been dispatching the Prime Minister and ministers all over the world to drum up investments from countries like China in full knowledge that proposed deals like the Nexen one or any of the several other deals now being worked on in the oil patch would be highly controversial. Irresponsible and incompetent in its refusal to answer questions Liberals have raised for weeks, either because they're afraid to admit they don't have the answers or they're afraid to tell Canadians the truth. Well, Mr. Speaker, the truth is that Canadians don't have confidence that our interests are being addressed and protected. They have serious concerns and they're eager to learn more about this specific deal, its ramifications, and its long-term effects on one of our most important natural resource sectors. Le gouvernement conservateur
The Conservative government had promised to review the net benefit notion for Canada with regard to takeover by foreign interests following the rejection of the Potash Corporation's offer in October 2010. Due to the government's inaction, Canada currently faces a wave of takeovers by foreign investors, and the rules have not yet been clarified. We understand the need for the government to maintain some flexibility in exercising its judgment, given that there are no two agreements that will be identical. But we also believe that foreign takeovers must be done transparently, and Canadians should be informed about the guarantees that will be made and why a transaction is considered to be of net benefit to Canadians. Let's be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals are in favor of foreign investment, but since 2006 and especially since 2010, we are asking for greater clarity when it comes to takeovers by foreign countries. The government doesn't show transparency or and must ensure that this is not strictly political factors. And we must ensure that the rules are clear.
Legislation must provide some degree of flexibility because, Mr. Speaker, no two deals are the same. But very important questions loom large and need to be answered in order for Canadians to understand what guarantees might be given and why a transaction is deemed of net benefit to Canada. Firstly, because we have no national energy strategy in this country, as called for by Alberta's Premier and by our party for over 6 years, where does this and other transactions fit into our energy future? Where does it fit into our climate future? There's no doubt that case after case with respect to our approach to energy will continue to surface. From Keystone to the Northern Gateway Pipeline, another Conservative fiasco according to Jim Prentice, and now this Nexen deal. These Conservatives are lurching from crisis to crisis instead of defining a national energy strategy which includes changing the Investment Canada Act. Let me take a moment to answer the Prime Minister's question when he responded to Premier Redford by saying that when it came to a national energy strategy, he had, quote, no idea what she was talking about, close quote. So let's enlighten the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, and let him know what we are talking about. This is about building on the early and tentative work by provincial and federal ministers in full respect of provincial jurisdiction. And it would encompass the following key elements: regulatory reform, energy efficiency, energy information, markets, international trade, smart grid technology, reliability of our electricity system, building codes, building standards, transportation efficiency. Furthermore, we should be conducting a full and transparent analysis of federal and provincial programs and fiscal incentives and disincentives applicable specifically to the energy sector in all of its forms: fossil fuels, wind, solar, geothermal, biofuels, and nuclear, with a view to facilitating what here? Canada's transition to a low-carbon future. That's what the race is all about in the global marketplace, Mr. Speaker. But there are more questions to be raised. Here's another. In this sector, the energy sector, what should the maximum ownership limits be set at? 49%? No limits? If a company commits to keeping their head office in Canada, what if they don't? Similarly, CNOOC is committing to keep all 3,000 Nexen jobs and its current management team. What if they don't? How are these commitments enforceable? When should we demand that Canadians be on the boards of directors? And how many? What about Canadians on the boards of the foreign companies who are targeting Canadian companies? When we hear about national security interests raised recently by CSIS, when do these trump a potential deal? What are national security interests exactly? Are they related to information technology, Are they related to trade secrets? Are they related to intellectual property and patents? These need to be better defined. How do we treat state-owned enterprises versus privately held or publicly traded companies? Should we be factoring in human rights considerations in the country from whence the acquiring company is coming? And yet again, Mr. Speaker, what if Canadians have invested in a Canadian enterprise through government support? That might be direct financial support in the form of programming assistance, or it might be fiscal assistance in, for example, the writing off of assets over a shorter period of time. That is an investment made by the Canadian taxpayer in a Canadian company. If a company has been supported by Canadian taxpayers in one of those two forms, how do we deal? How should we see that investment in terms of the Canadian people? Should the Canadian taxpayers be indemnified? Should we be asking for Canadian taxpayers to get some of their money back? Here's another question, Mr. Speaker, that this transaction is raising that ought to have been addressed again in committee months ago, if not years ago, by the government working with all parties. Should foreign ownership limits by companies or sectors be brought in? Some estimates say that today in Canada, 2/3 of oil sands production is now owned already by foreign companies based on shareholders. Should that be a factor? Should that be allowed to continue? Is 2/3 too high, just right, too low? None of this has been subjected to what I would call the light of evidence and analysis in a good working place like, for example, the Industry Committee. Here's another question, a very important question Canadians are asking about this transaction. Can Canadians invest in the country where the buyer comes from? If not, what should we be looking to ask for? What should we be looking to leverage from that country? For example, some have said in this case that Canada ought to be demanding better access to the financial services sector so that Canadian banks, for example, can expand their operations in what's clearly a huge market. Here's another question. Will there be full compliance with Canadian labour and environmental laws? What conditions should be met with respect to enhancing community and social commitments? It's clear the issue of enforceability, Mr. Speaker, weaves its way through each and every one of these questions. These questions are fundamental to our jobs, to innovation, to technologies, patents, intellectual property, fundamental to the deployment of Canadian capital, to growing and maintaining our expertise in our trades, in our management, and yes, even our ownership. These questions are also fundamental to whether or not Canada's companies are going to compete in global markets. All of these questions, Mr. Speaker, have not seen the light of day, despite the promise made by the government. Now we find ourselves in a situation where Canada is being squeezed. Actually, the Prime Minister is being squeezed, and his ministers are being squeezed, because they've gone all over the world and they've told people we're open for business, come one, come all, everything's for sale at the highest price. But now we face a situation where it's going into the secrecy of Cabinet, where the net benefit test is not working as it is presently construed under the Act, and we're in a situation now where Canada is vulnerable, Mr. Speaker. So in closing, I would suggest this, that all parties come together in the Industry Committee, support my colleague's motion for a major study on this question, and come back and bring enlightened information for all parliamentarians to learn from so that we can set the right net benefit test for Canadians going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that Canadians are asking for more transparency on this issue, And it's not set out anywhere in the Act that the legal process excludes public consultation. So can the member tell us if it wouldn't be more relevant, politically speaking, to keep up or maintain these public consultations?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say to my colleague from the New Democratic Party the following. The institution that we call the House of Commons spends some $500 million per year. $500 million. The work, in my opinion, that has to be made in this case, or carried out in this case, should take place at the Industry Committee. We have already invested in the committee. We have the members, the staff, everything's already there. So the issue of gathering the perspectives of Canadian society would be easily done at the committee, rather than going and holding consultations outside of this place. We could easily bring people here. We could work with computers, over the internet, and save a great deal of money for Canadian taxpayers and do the necessary work. Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I very much appreciate the comments from my colleague on this particular issue, and I think he's raised a number of excellent points. I want to elaborate on one in particular, that being the what's in it for Canadian business. If we pursue this deal and go forward with this deal, what's in it for Canadian business? And he had mentioned our banking sector and how there would be potential possibilities for this banking sector with increased trade with China. But Jeffrey Simpson raises the concern about reciprocity. And he said, to really judge this deal, we should look at it in reverse. If this was a Canadian company trying to embark on a deal like this within China, would this deal actually go ahead? I'm thinking there's one answer to that, and that would be it would never happen. So there has to be some kind of benefit for Canadian business. Does my colleague agree with this? And where would those sectors be? What sectors of Canadian business would benefit from increased trade with China, in fact?
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Thanks, my colleague, for the question. There is no doubt that it's fair to say that the odds are not quite even when it comes to this kind of acquisition and looking for reciprocity with the Chinese authorities. Having said that, I believe that China is a state in full transition. China's come a million miles in the last 2 decades and is making progress as we speak. And it's struggling under the weight, for example, of a country that has 400 to 500 million people living on approximately $8 a day. So it has its internal challenges. But that being said, I think there's a lot of possibility here for negotiation between Canada and China. But I don't want to single out China. I'm sure my colleague member did not want to either. There are many countries that will be looking very closely at Canada's natural resource sector, and for that matter, at Canada's water going forward. And how we treat each and every one of these applications is what's really at question here. We need to make sure that this is really a benefit to Canadians. Canadian shareholders, yes. Canadian companies, yes. But Canadians writ large. Canadian jobs in particular. We need to be very, very vigilant that the jobs are here. There is enough offshoring of jobs going on right now from North America into Southeast Asia. So my view is that the financial services sector is one possibility. The manufacturing sector is another possibility. The tourism sector is yet a third possibility, and there are others. This is exactly what we should be examining in detail in committee.
Questions
and comments?
L'honorable député de la...
The honourable member for La Salle-et-Marne. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague from Ottawa South for his excellent speech today. I must say that indeed he has raised a lot of issues. And my question now for my colleague is that, in fact, the Investment Canada Act that we're aware of and that has been somewhat amended but without having been changed in a major way, it has been in existence since 1985. So can you explain to me why, under the Liberal government, there wasn't more of an insistence on public consultations to improve this legislation, which has serious shortcomings? Mr. Speaker, we could pass our time examining what happened 15, 30, 40 years ago. I would prefer to address the issues that are before us now, how to make progress for Canadians in this area. Where are we headed as a country in the energy sector, more or less across the country? And that's why I raised the issue in my speech of creating a national energy strategy, which would affect the national strategy for climate change, because those two are really intertwined. It's impossible to take them separately. So for me, the big issue is not to look to the past, it's to look to the future and decide how we as parliamentarians are going to act to improve the situation in Canada. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I commend my colleague from Ottawa South for a very cogent presentation on the number of issues that we're looking at. I'm surprised I haven't heard anyone in the House today give us the words of the CEO of CNOOC, so we know what kind of people will be taking over Nexen. The CEO of CNOOC, Wang Yilin, is quoted on August 29th Wall Street Journal as saying, quote, referring to his offshore energy resources, he refers to them as our, quote, national territory and a strategic weapon, unquote. And I know CSIS is concerned about national security concerns, yet they don't seem to be troubling the Prime Minister. I want to emphasize again that if the Canada-Chinese Investment Treaty goes through, questions such as the one the member from Ottawa South will be answered for us. Article 7 of that treaty says a contracting party may not require that an enterprise of that party appoint individuals of any particular nationality as senior management positions. So we're discussing something today, Mr. Speaker, that's inextricably linked to something we're not discussing, which is the China-Canada Investment Treaty. And I invite my friends' comments on that.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague, and it's not surprising that the government is proceeding surreptitiously here. These are major changes. These are risky propositions that we have not even had a chance to examine, not only in this House, but not in committee. Canadians haven't been engaged. I don't know if the major industrial sectors in this country have been engaged. They may have been, they may not have been. I don't know whether other groups in Canadian society have been asked to comment on the merits of this proposed treaty. I think that what we're seeing here is a kind of underhandedness which is disrespectful of Parliament and disrespectful of Canadians. Under the guise of promoting trade, running around the world and saying we are the only ones open for business, you know, that carries with it a certain amount of risk, Mr. Speaker, because it actually weakens Canada's negotiation position, I think, with different foreign entities like China. And the comments that were referred to earlier are precisely the kinds of comments we should be examining in committee. In fact, we should be calling for the President and CEO of CNOOC to appear before committee to explain those kinds of comments so we have a better understanding of what's at stake. But once again, there will be transaction after transaction after transaction coming forward until we flesh out the net benefit test appropriately for Canadians. We're going to be going from crisis to crisis to crisis. There are many deals in the pipeline, Mr. Speaker, ready to be negotiated right now in the oil patch. And these deals are watching very carefully as to how Parliament here is going to proceed.
Reprise de débat,
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Nickel Belt.